that the pleasure is in recitation and in live recitation. So the first thing who are here today would probably love to hear lines which are rhythmic, poetic, and beautiful in the language that you dream in. What does true poetry constitute? And I'm sure the poets will agree with me as well. First, that poetry must deal with permanent passions and permanent problems. Somehow when I look at a group of Indians, I'm absolutely convinced that they are all from the city of Lucknow. But I have been very happily told that you come from so many different parts, but especially from North India. I have not earned my right to be here. This is completely gratuitous. And the one line about Urdu being reintroduced in what is definitely a college in India was done for very well thought out reasons. And it was done at a time when, if you are following Indian politics more clearly, it was a difficult time to be able to do it. But we did manage. I'm happy that our children responded so well. And I'm proud, and there's a difference between being happy and proud. I'm proud that our children have, for the last 2 years, where they have now reached board examination, school leaving classes, have also topped the country because of their interest in the subject. It's something which remained untapped for a long time. Now, rather than looking at this as some kind of regressive step, because that's the way in which a certain part of the city considered it, we also have introduced artificial learning and robotics. So a child can take artificial learning and robotics, and he can also take Urdu. What is more important is that he becomes the best version of himself, which I am sure you as parents also realize and want for your children as well. Now this evening, as we wait for 2 more poets to join us, I'm going to be a little schoolmasterish. I've done it for 40 years, so I know how to deal with you. None of you are too old to be spanked, all right? So you will listen carefully. However, there is some kind of credit which is given to your age. So if you want to go to the Madhushala, you're most welcome to do so, all right? I shall be joining you and partaking of this immediately after this talk. When Uday invited me, he specifically asked me to talk about our reaction to poetry. Now, we don't need to speak in Urdu just for that. I could speak in Hindi, I guess, but I'm more comfortable with this. But poetry is universal, and our response to poetry is universal, and perhaps this is a good time for us to remind ourselves as to why we are here for a soiree of this sort this evening. Are we really here to listen to poetry, or are we here to be seen and to see? Whatever the reason may be, I want you to tap into what you did in school and excite that zest and interest for that which is creative and beautiful in expression, and be able to enjoy the session that we have been invited to today. Now, every one of us has some idea of what is poetry. And many of us have a very wrong idea of what is poetry. I taught adolescent boys for 40 years. And so they would come to me with their love poems. All right? And most of it was rubbish. But they felt that if we give rhymes at the end of lines, that becomes poetry. Sir, मैंने एक poetry लिखा. All right? I'm sure you've heard this kind of thing, or some of you are putting your heads down, maybe you've done the same thing as well. So, something like, oh my, tell me why, birdie fly in the sky. Okay, that's not poetry. That is perhaps the lowest form of rhyme, but that's all that it is. But what is poetry then? Okay? And if we really examine some of the lines that resonate in us, whether it is from the scriptures, whether it is from Shakespeare, whether it is from some of the texts that you have read in different languages and enjoy, and which keep coming back to you, you will see that there are two main aspects of poetry which we recognize. First, poetry is almost always an emotional outpouring. Okay? You can't talk about nuclear science and poetry. Okay? You can't talk about, as Richard Dawkins does, the poetry of reality, although people are trying to do that. Look at the beauty in science, look at the symmetry in science. Oh, my heart is filled, and dances with the daffodils or whatever. Okay? So first it is an emotional outpouring. And if it is an emotional outpouring, it is an outpouring which definitely needs language. Because how do you communicate? Now, lovers might look into each other's eyes and say, okay, we love each other and we don't need to speak, It's such a wonderful relationship. But when the pressure cooker has got burnt, the food has got burnt in the pressure cooker, then all that love flies out of the window. So, we do need words, and in fact, we need the best words to be able to express ourselves. Now, we might have some very good words, but then how does it become even better? And remember, I'm not talking about English poetry alone. I'm talking about poetry across the entire world. Much of it is because of the quality of language and the choice of language that we have. So let's look at it again. First, it is an outpouring of emotions. And second, it is this outpouring of emotions in the best of language, in the particular language group into which we fall. I would need to add a word of warning here. While it is very possible for us to understand poetry in different languages, it is near nigh impossible for us to write quality poetry unless we are immersed in that language itself. Today we will be listening to 3 poets, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the style of this poetry is so significant. And we will see how they will play with words. They will use the finest words, sometimes in the shortest of phrases. The essence of poetry will be grasped, and we will love it. It was Alexander Pope, and I'm drawing from my experience in teaching English, who said that true poetry is nature to advantage dressed. And then the next line, what oft was thought, but never so well expressed. Okay? Why do we resonate with poetry? You hear 2 lines, and you'll be hearing so much this evening. You'll say, "Arey yaar, ye to maine bhi socha tha. अरे ये ख्याल जो है बार-बार मुझे आती." Over and over again I've thought, you've stolen the words from my mouth, but you never had those words in your mouth in the first place. All right? So this is what we see. What oft was thought. If I were to introduce, or a poet was to introduce something newfangled to you, it really wouldn't interest you very much. But because it is something which you've done over and over again, or thought so repeatedly about, You react to it so very well. Once again, the study of poetry is different from the composition and the recitation of poetry. Perhaps in our experience, you have stopped reading English poetry from the time you left school. There may be some exceptions, but by and large, you would have stopped reading English poetry from the time you left school. And I don't blame you after 40 years of teaching. Okay? I do understand that we've gone terribly wrong somewhere. In the English-speaking world, poetry is always to be appreciated through its written form. When we take any other language, you take Russian, you take Arabic, Persian, you take Urdu, right? There we see that the pleasure is in recitation and in live recitation. So the first thing is that we are forced to always read poetry, and thereafter we have this absolutely disgusting thing of the analysis of a poem. Now, I don't blame the teaching system for this, because we are training minds to be able to appreciate the best of our language, which is reflected in literature. But remember, when you sit down, Hindi, for example, you had to do Jeevanese, those wretched things, biographies about the poets. Most of them were absolutely awful people, or they were just indulging in beggary almost. And we were to appreciate that. Now look at the poem. You look at the theme, then you look at the content, then you look at the meter, then you look at the general impression. Everything is categorized. Admittedly, in the study of anything, you always have to use analysis. But the synthesis, which should come thereafter, was something which was left out for us. Those of you who are here today would probably love to hear lines which are rhythmic, poetic, and beautiful in the language that you dream in. Notice I have not said your first language, because children in Singapore have English as their first language. I was speaking to a friend just now, and his children, they refuse to speak Hindi because they can't pronounce it well enough, and reading and writing, of course, is a far cry. But what is important is, which language do you dream in? And when you dream in a particular language, that is the language in which you can express yourself most beautifully and most fully as well. What oft was taught must be taught in the language in which you are. Now, a critic might say, but this is, it's very short-sighted. Why can't we write in many languages? And what is the problem in that? There's no problem in it, except that it becomes an academic exercise. It's not genuine. It's not true. The sincerity of that content can be best expressed in the language in which you dream. And so I would advise you that even if you don't dream in Hindustani, Urdu, Hindi, or that from which Urdu has been derived, listen to it, appreciate it, okay? But understand that unless you immerse yourself in a language, you may not be able to get the fullest measure out of it. I have one or two more things to say. Poetry, as we talked about, nature to advantage dressed, has to be appreciated in both content as well as in technique. Today you will be listening to a technique which is largely Eastern. All right? The sher, all right? The ghazal, and so on. Many of you will be familiar with these terms. And you will see that the technique today might not influence us too much because we have not come here as aficionados of the language. We have come here as friends to appreciate a pleasant evening. However, what does true poetry constitute? And I'm sure the poets will agree with me as well. First, that poetry must deal with permanent passions and permanent problems. You can't do some wishy-washy thing. Why is Shakespeare in the English-speaking world? Why is Shakespeare such a great influence that his words, which are the words of the English language, the combination of his words have slipped into our daily language as well? Why? For he speaks about things which even 500 years after his writing still resonate with us. Jealousy, love, anger, a sense of hopelessness. Okay? These are just some examples. But remember, they are permanent passions. They are not passions that only refer to one particular generation. Shakespeare does not talk about regionalism, the difference between colors. Right? He does not talk about dowry deaths. And when poets do speak about these things, and I guess they must, they will last how long? 100 years? 50 years? 200 years? But not beyond that. But the permanent passion, okay, as I said, of jealousy, the permanent passions of love, these will last forever.